I was always very healthy as a child, and for a long time into adulthood, I never had any problems that required any medical intervention. I would hear about people my age having severe allergies and having things that they need to have surgery for, but I got by for a long time without any serious problems that need to be corrected. Of course, that can change sometimes with age. We begin to develop more problems, but one problem I always had was that whenever I suffered a cold, I would have terrible problems breathing through my nose. I think the nasal congestion was the worst thing I experienced through a cold, and I'd use nose drops and nasal sprays, but I just have a terrible time and feel awful about trying to breathe through my nose. And there came a point later on in adulthood where I was having a lot of trouble using a lot of nasal sprays, taking a lot of oral decongestants, and realized I needed to go get this checked out. So I did go see an ear, nose, and throat specialist. Now, he did some x-rays, but they also have this special scope that he uses to look inside your nose. It's about, I guess that long or so, and he has kind of a scope on the end. And there's this very small plastic tube with a light and a camera on it that he can basically shove up your nose, because that's what he did basically. And so he put that thing up there one time and kept going higher and higher, and it finally got hurting so bad he said, okay, I'll just stop. And so he did, and it turned out that I had a deviated septum, and not only a deviated septum but also enlarged turbinates. Turbinates are a structure that kind of look like turbines, and sometimes they're larger than they should be, but your septum is the wall that runs right down the middle of your nose, and it's supposed to divide your nostrils into two roughly equal chambers so that the airflow can be roughly equal in both sides. Well, my septum was deviated, and apparently I had been born that way, and so the solution to that was going to be surgery to correct the deviated septum. So we scheduled the surgery. Went in for surgery. They rolled me into the operating room. I was knocked out for the surgery, and I was glad that I was, considering what came later. And I was thinking, this is going to be a very interesting experience, and hopefully it'll solve this problem that I've got. So I wake up in absolute misery because my nose was completely packed. And I had to go the rest of that day and part of the next morning with my nose packed and breathing strictly through my mouth. Absolutely miserable. Did not get any sleep that night. So I went in the next day, and he took out a lot of that packing, but there was also some bracing on both sides of the septum. So the packing wasn't completely removed. The worst of it was taken out, but I still had these braces on both sides of my septum to hold it in place. Well, saw a doctor again, I think it was Monday, and he took those out, and it looked like everything was doing fine. My breathing was fine. Somebody asked me, is it getting better? I said, no, it's just better because the obstruction's been fixed. So I was out of work for a while, went back to work, and I was working in a poultry processing plant at the time, doing a lot of bending, lifting, stooping. And one day I leaned over into a vat, and this was in early November. I think the surgery was in October, and I developed a very severe nosebleed. Blood was just coming out something awful. So I went to the nurse's office because there was an on-site nurse, and they tried to help me stop that breathing a little bit, but the safety man ends up taking me to a local hospital. This job was about 25 miles from where I live, so I was taken to a hospital in that town. The emergency room doctor, and I was there for 2 or 3 hours, I guess, but they saw me right away because of this bleeding, and he cauterizes the inside of my nose, takes a very hot heated instrument and sticks it up there and cauterizes my nose to stop the bleeding. Of course, I didn't realize how much I'd bled, and it's very complicated how this worked out, but I ended up having to go from that hospital to my specialist office and then being admitted to another hospital that night. So I get down to the specialist office. I was taken there by somebody else, obviously, and my specialist was out of town, but the younger partner and an older partner were there. They both took a look at me, and the older guy says, well, we need to get the rockets in up there. And those are things that they stick up there, and they expand, and they kind of block your breathing again. But as they were doing that and putting the packing bucket up there again, I began to get even though I was sitting down in a chair and kind of leaned back, I began to get extremely faint. Haven't felt like that without actually blacking out, I don't think, ever. So this one nurse lifts my feet, the other one is fanning me, and I finally get over that and sort of come back from that, and the doctor decides I need to be admitted to the hospital overnight for evaluation. And he tells me that they're going to have an IV in their arm in case they have to give me blood, because that's what the faintness was from, apparently, because I had lost a considerable amount of blood. So I go to the hospital, and of course my nose is packed again that night. Spent a miserable night in the hospital, and then the next day I'm released to go back to see my ENT specialist again, or his partner actually. So it had this bleeding accident and had the packing and had to be admitted overnight. And he takes the packing out, and then he and his partner poke and prod around to make sure there's not going to be any more bleeding, and I'm released. So that nosebleed situation was a very scary thing, but it did fix my problem, at least for the time being. I was able to breathe normally, and in spite of the fact it was a hard thing to go through, in spite of the fact that I'd had that bleeding emergency and had to be admitted to the hospital, it was still worth it. But unfortunately, that didn't solve the problem completely, because about 6 years down the road I began to have another problem, and I was living in another city at that point, working for a telecommunications company, and started to have breathing problems again. So I went to another ENT specialist and decided that I needed to have an allergy test. Well, it turned out they tested me for allergies, and I did discover that I had several allergies to interfere with my bleeding, interfere with my breathing, but he said that's only part of your problem. You've got some sinus problems that are going to require surgery again to really fix this. So we schedule that surgery. This is a second surgery on my nose. It's about 6 years later, and he says, I'm going to try not to pack your nose this time. And in fact, he told me that the kind of surgery that had been performed on me earlier had become outdated, and they weren't doing it quite that way anymore. So I go in for that surgery, they roll me in, I'm knocked out completely again, and then I wake up feeling a lot better. Of course, I'd had pain medication, so I wasn't hurting, and so I thought that things were going to be fine, and I was released to go back home and put on sick leave for a little bit. But the problem that developed after that was I experienced a tremendous amount of sinus pain. And the second ENT in this other city, he had prescribed some pain medication, but that wasn't quite doing it, and so he prescribed a yet stronger pain medication. This went on for maybe a couple of weeks. I had pretty severe headaches right up here where my sinuses are. And so that was a case where I had to go through some pain for a while and control it somewhat with medication. But the final result of that was that my breathing became normal, and from that day to this I'm able to breathe just fine and feel good about my breathing. And it solved the problem. It made my breathing normal. My life has been so much better as a result. But I did have to go through some headache pain to get there. I did have to go through that first nosebleed emergency, and I admit that was kind of scary. But still, I'm glad that I had those procedures because they made my life a lot better. And in addition to having the structural problems corrected in my nose, I also developed a problem of a habit of vigorous hand washing to prevent getting those cold germs, because I do not like colds. But since those two surgeries, I found that saline spray helps more than I ever thought it could back when I had the obstruction. Saline spray helps, and Benadryl helps. So when you get a cold, I found a very effective treatment for a cold is to take Benadryl or one of the older generation antihistamines. It has to be one of the older generation because the newer ones won't do it. But Benadryl and chlortrimeton are the generic equivalents I found are very helpful when you have a cold, and also hand washing helps prevent the cold. Those were my first experiences with, I guess you could call general anesthesia or being put to sleep for surgery, and I had that happen to me several more times, and I discovered pretty quick that that wasn't anything to be worried or concerned about. You know, it was easy, quick, and I just had to be careful, you know, the day or so afterward. But In spite of all that I went through, in spite of the fact that I had the nosebleed emergency and had to go through some extra treatment and a night of hospitalization, in spite of the fact that I eventually had the second surgery and had to experience a lot of headache pain from that, which did go away within a couple of weeks, I'm very glad that I had those procedures. You know, everything can't just be easy all the time. I wish we lived in a world where all pain could be eliminated, but unfortunately it can't. Sometimes you do have to go through some pain and some complications to fix a problem. But the point is that the first surgery and then later the second surgery corrected my problem, and I was able to breathe just as well as anyone else, and it feels so good to not have that problem, to not have to struggle with breathing through my nose. It's just outstanding. But you just have to be prepared to go through some stuff to fix stuff, but it worked very well for me. So that's a little bit of what that's like and what you might be able to expect, and I'd say all in all, it was well worth it to have that nasal surgery. In spite of the problems, I'm very glad that I had both of them. And that's my report on my experience with nasal surgery.